The world had shrunk to the size of a single, ragged breath. In, out, a gasp of fire, a release of dust. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the cracked, white earth. And Elena ran. Her feet, stripped of their shoes miles back, were a ruin of cuts and blisters. Each step was a fresh agony, a sharp reminder of the unforgiving ground she was forced to claim as her only path. The sharp edges of flint and stone bit into her soles, leaving a faint, dark trail that the thirsty dust quickly swallowed. She didn't dare look back. She didn't need to. The sound was her shadow, a rhythmic, relentless drumming that had pursued her since the first gray light of dawn had spilled over the horizon. Hoofbeats. Sometimes a single horse, sometimes two. She could no longer tell. The sound was a pulse, counting down the last seconds of her life. It rose and fell with the contours of the land, fading when she crested a low rise, only to return louder, closer. When she descended into a shallow, shimmering basin of heat, it was the sound of the end. Her lungs were twin fires, her throat a desert in itself. She had forgotten the taste of water, remembering only the metallic tang of fear and the grit of the earth on her tongue. Her vision swam, the distant mesas blurring into a wavering line of purple and rust. Everything was sharp angles and blinding light. A lone saguaro stood like a silent, pitying witness to her desperate flight. She stumbled, catching herself on hands already raw and bleeding, the tiny thorns of a desiccated bush leaving fiery pinpricks in her palms. "Get up!" The command came from a place deeper than thought, a primal instinct that refused to yield. "Get up!" And then, through the haze of exhaustion and pain, she saw it. Not a mirage, but something solid, something real, a straight line in a world of chaotic nature, a fence post, gray and weathered, leaning like a tired old man. Then another, and another, connected by a strand of rusted wire. It was a boundary, a place, hope, a feeling so foreign it was almost painful, flickered in her chest. Beyond the fence lay a ranch. It was a hard-bitten, solitary place, clinging to the edge of the wilderness as if by sheer force of will. A small, sturdy house built of thick, sun-bleached timbers stood beside a barn whose wood had silvered with age. A broken wagon wheel leaned against the house, a testament to some past failure. Near the barn, a heavy wooden table, its surface split and warped by 100 seasons of sun and storm, lay on its side. A rusting mortar and pestle, forgotten by the door, told a story of grinding grain, of a life lived through labor. The whole place was steeped in a profound silence, a stillness that seemed to absorb the vast, empty noise of the desert. There were no horses in the corral, no smoke from the stone chimney. It looked abandoned, a skeleton picked clean by the elements. It was perfect. The hoofbeats sounded closer now, a confident, steady canter. They knew she was fading. With the last of her strength, she found a gap in the fence and scrambled through, the rusted wire tearing a long, shallow scratch across her arm. She didn't feel it. She ran for the shadow cast by the overturned table, a small, dark patch of mercy in the relentless glare. She collapsed into it, her body giving out all at once, her cheek pressed against the splintered, rough wood. The cool darkness was a balm. She closed her eyes, her breath coming in shallow, shuddering pants. The drumming of the horses seemed to be inside her skull now, a frantic echo of her own heart. Let them come. A strange calm washed over her. It was better to die here, in the quiet shade of a stranger's forgotten table, than to be taken back. To be caught was not just to die, but to be erased, to have her final moments be a symphony of their sneering triumph. Here, at least, she could die alone. The hoofbeats grew to a thunder and then, abruptly, they stopped. Not faded, but stopped. Had they passed by? She strained her ears, listening past the roar of blood in her head. Silence. A deeper silence than before. A held breath. Then, a man's voice, rough and distant, shouting a name she didn't know. Another voice answered. They were talking, deciding. She pressed herself tighter against the ground, trying to will herself invisible, Please, she prayed to a God she no longer believed in. Please, just go. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The sun crept across the sky, shrinking her patch of shade. And then the hoofbeats began again. But they were different now. Slower. Fading. They were leaving. They were riding away. Relief washed over her so intensely it left her weak and trembling. She had done it. She had lost them. She lay there, limp and spent, listening until the last faint rhythm was swallowed by the immense quiet of the land. She must have drifted into a state that was neither sleep nor wakefulness, a stupor of pure exhaustion. The next thing she knew, another sound broke the silence. It was not the sound of horses. It was the slow, deliberate crunch of boots on gravel. A heavy tread, unhurried. It came from the house, a place she had assumed was empty. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She had traded one set of hunters for another. The steps came closer, measured and calm. There was no shouting, no call to surrender, just the steady, rhythmic sound of a man walking, a sound as inevitable as the setting of the sun. She risked a glance, peering through a crack in the wooden tabletop. She saw a pair of worn leather boots, scuffed and dusty, stop a few feet away from her hiding place. They stood there for a long moment, motionless. She held her breath. Maybe he hadn't seen her. Maybe he would turn and walk away. But the boots didn't move. She could feel his presence, a solid weight in the shimmering air. Then, the man knelt. Not quickly, but with the slow, deliberate movement of someone whose body was accustomed to hard work. His knees cracked softly. He leaned forward, and she saw his face. He was a man carved from the land itself. His shoulders were broad, his frame thick with the muscle of labor, not of brawling. His skin was the color of tanned leather, creased around the eyes by years of squinting into the sun. His hair was dark and streaked with gray at the temples, cut short and practical, but it was his eyes that held her. They were a deep, quiet brown, as still and unreadable as a shaded pool of water. They held no malice, no excitement, just a deep, world-weary calm. He looked at her, and in his gaze, she felt seen not as prey, but as a fact, a broken thing that had washed up on his shore. In his right hand, he held an axe. It was a working tool, its blade sharp and clean, its handle worn smooth with use. A faint, sticky residue of pine sap clung to the metal near the haft. It was a tool for splitting wood, for building, for surviving. But in that moment, it was also a weapon. The sight of it, combined with the quiet intensity of the man, sent a fresh wave of fear through her. He was dangerous, not in the loud, cruel way of the men who had chased her, but in a deeper, more contained way. He looked like a man who had buried things, secrets and sorrows, deep in the hard earth and had no intention of ever digging them up again. He saw the direction of her gaze, the flicker of terror as she looked at the axe. He didn't move to hide it, nor did he brandish it. He simply held it, his knuckles white. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He was waiting for her to speak, to explain herself. Elena opened her mouth, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. She swallowed, the motion scraping her raw throat. She tried again, forcing the words out from a place of deep, instinctual fear, a place where memory and the present moment collided in a storm of panic. The words were not what she intended to say, but they were the only ones that would come. They were an echo from another time, another fear. "Be gentle," she whispered, her voice a fragile, broken thing. "It's too fast." The plea hung in the hot, still air between them. It was a strange thing to say to a man with an axe who had found her collapsed on his property. It spoke of a terror that went beyond her current plight. It was a ghost of a phrase, torn from a different nightmare. Something shifted in the man's quiet eyes. A flicker of, not pity, but understanding. His gaze, which had been taking in her torn dress, her bleeding feet, her exhaustion, now focused solely on her face, on the profound animal terror he saw there. He looked at the fear in her eyes, not the wounds on her body. His knuckles relaxed their grip on the axe handle. The weapon, held in midair as if he had been about to rise or set it down, froze. He held the pose for a heartbeat, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be listening not to her words, but to the history of pain behind them. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion that was the opposite of a threat, he moved. He didn't step forward. He didn't reach for her. He pushed himself backward, away from her, rising to his feet in a single, fluid motion. He took one step back, and then another, putting distance between them. It was a gesture of profound and unexpected grace. He was giving her space. He was giving her air. He did not ask her name. He did not ask who chased her. He did not touch her. He simply retreated, his quiet brown eyes still holding hers, acknowledging the fragile truce her broken words had created. He stood there, a tall, solitary figure against the vast, indifferent landscape, the axe now hanging loosely at his side. The immediate threat was gone, replaced by a deep and unsettling question. He was a man alone, in a place where survival depended on strength and suspicion. A woman, a runaway, was a liability, a magnet for trouble. The logical response was a threat, a demand, an order to leave. Yet he had responded to her plea, a plea born of a separate trauma, with a quiet, watchful gentleness. Why would a man like this, a recluse in the heart of a merciless land, choose a moment of quiet deference over one of intimidation? What ghosts of his own had her words awakened? The man, Caleb, said nothing more. He simply turned and walked back toward the small, sturdy house. The scuff of his boots on the dry earth was the only sound. Elena watched him go. Every muscle in her body tensed, ready to bolt again despite the fire in her lungs and the agony in her feet. He disappeared inside, the screen door whining shut with a weary sound. The silence he left behind was heavy, filled with questions she was too exhausted to form. She remained frozen in her sliver of shade, a hunted animal that had found an impossibly strange and quiet corner of the world. He was gone for what felt like an hour, though it was likely only a minute. When he reappeared, he carried a dented tin canteen. He walked back to her hiding spot, his steps just as measured, just as unhurried as before. He didn't approach the overturned table directly. Instead, he stopped about 10 feet away, a distance that felt both safe and unnervingly formal. He uncapped the canteen, the metal squeaking in protest, and set it on the ground. Then, in a gesture that disarmed her more than any threat could have, he turned his back on her and walked away, heading toward the barn. He left the choice entirely to her. For a long moment, Elena didn't move. The canteen sat in the blistering sun, a small, gray promise. It could be a trick. It could be a trap. But the thirst was a physical entity inside her, a clawing beast that had long since silenced reason. Slowly, painfully, she crawled out from under the table. The sunlight struck her like a physical blow, and she squeezed her eyes shut against the glare. On her hands and knees, she crept toward the canteen, her movements stiff and jerky. She knelt before it as if it were an altar. She stared into the small opening, seeing her own reflection, a distorted, wavering ghost with wild eyes and a face smudged with dirt and streaked with dried sweat. Her hand trembled as she lifted it. The metal was hot from the sun, but the water that sloshed inside was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She lifted it to her lips, intending to take a small sip, to be careful. But the moment the cool liquid touched her cracked lips, control vanished. She drank greedily, desperately, the water spilling down her chin and soaking the front of her torn dress. She drank like someone who was afraid the offering would be snatched away, like a creature stealing from a trap that had not yet sprung. It was only water, but it tasted of life, of a future she hadn't believed existed a few minutes earlier. She drank until her stomach ached, until the clawing beast inside her was soothed into a dull, throbbing peace. When she finally lowered the canteen, gasping for air, the world came back into sharp focus. Her universe, which for hours had been an endless, burning expanse, had now shrunk to this small patch of shade beneath the broken table. It was a world defined by smells, the dry, sweet scent of old hay drifting from the barn, the faint, sharp tang of pine resin that clung to the man, the earthy smell of his sweat, and the clean, mineral scent of the water on her skin. It was the smell of a life, a hard and solitary one, but a life nonetheless. She felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if she had fallen from the sky and landed in a place that operated by rules she did not understand. A voice, low and rough as sandstone, cut through her thoughts. "You're hurt." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Caleb was standing by the entrance to the barn, his hand resting on the large wooden door. He hadn't moved closer, but his gaze was fixed on her, his expression as unreadable as ever. The words, though spoken softly, landed like a touch. Elena flinched, pulling her legs in closer to her body, a purely defensive reflex. She had been running from men whose words were always a prelude to a harsh hand, a shove, a blow. His simple, detached observation felt just as invasive, a cataloging of her weaknesses. She looked down at her feet, at the raw, bloody mess of her soles, at the long, angry scratch on her arm where the fence wire had caught her. The pain, which had been a dull, roaring background noise, now became sharp and specific. He seemed to understand her reaction. He didn't press the point. Instead, he turned his attention to the barn door. He lifted a heavy wooden crossbar, the wood groaning in its brackets. The doors swung open with a long, drawn-out creak, a sound like a weary sigh. The darkness inside the barn was cool and absolute, a stark contrast to the unforgiving glare of the yard. It promised relief from the sun, but it was also a place of shadows, a place where things could be hidden. Elena's eyes were drawn to the interior of the barn as the light spilled into it. It was neat, orderly. Stalls lined one wall, empty but clean, the floors covered in fresh-smelling straw. Tools hung in their designated places on the walls, shovels, pitchforks, bridles, and coils of rope. It was the space of a man who lived by routine and discipline. And there, hanging from a thick wooden peg near the door, was a rifle. It was a Winchester, its wooden stock worn smooth and dark with age and use, its long octagonal barrel a dull gunmetal gray. It wasn't new or fancy, but it was clean, cared for. A cracked leather strap was looped around the stock and barrel, allowing it to be slung over a shoulder. The sight of it sent a jolt through her, a cold tug-of-war between hope and fear. It was a tool of protection, a symbol of power in a powerless world. In her hands, it could be the final answer to the men who were hunting her. But it was his, and its presence there, so openly displayed, felt like another test, another unspoken question. A new, more complex fear began to eclipse the raw terror of the chase. She was in his territory, a stranger and an intruder. What if he wasn't her savior? What if he was just a different kind of captor, one who was patient? Caleb seemed to follow her gaze. He looked at the rifle, then back at her. For a long moment, the only sounds were the buzz of a fly and the gentle whisper of the wind moving through the dry grass beyond the fence. He turned his head slightly, his eyes leaving her to scan the vast, empty horizon, as if searching for something or someone. His profile was stark against the bright sky, the line of his jaw firm, his expression remote. He seemed a part of the landscape, as weathered and enduring as the mesas in the distance. When he spoke again, his voice was just as quiet, just as devoid of emotion as before. It carried on the still air, a simple, stunning offer. "Take it," he said, his eyes still fixed on that distant, unforgiving line where the earth met the sky. "If you need it." The offer hung between them, more shocking than the sight of the weapon itself. He was offering her the means to defend herself, the means to kill him. It was an act of trust so profound, so utterly at odds with the harsh reality of their world, that it bordered on madness. Or perhaps it was a deeper, more complicated calculation she couldn't begin to fathom. A man like him didn't survive out here by being careless. Elena stared at the rifle, then back at the man's unmoving silhouette. The trust he was offering was a weight, heavier than the rifle itself. To take it would be to accept a bond, to acknowledge a debt. To refuse it might be seen as an act of defiance, or worse, foolishness. The space he had so carefully maintained between them suddenly felt charged, a field of invisible force where her decision would determine everything that happened next. The cold distance he kept had felt like a form of protection, a silent agreement not to intrude. But now, it also felt like a chasm. He stood over there. She knelt over here, and the rifle hung in the balance. She thought of the men who had pursued her, their cruel laughter, the casual violence in their eyes. She thought of what they would do if they found her. The rifle promised a final, bloody kind of safety, but it also promised more violence, more running, more death. Her own voice, when she found it, was barely a whisper, a thread of sound nearly lost in the vast silence. "I don't want to shoot anyone," she murmured, speaking as much to herself as to him. She wasn't a killer. She was a witness. That was her crime, and it was her nature. She had seen something she wasn't meant to see, and her only defense had been to run. To take up that rifle would be to become something else, to become like them. And she was so tired of being like them. Caleb gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't look at her, didn't register surprise or relief. He simply accepted her answer as another fact, another piece of information to be filed away in the quiet archives of his mind. The space between them remained, a cold, clear buffer. He had offered her water, and then he had offered her a weapon. Both were tools for survival. Both had been offered from a distance, without a single touch, without a single question about her name or her past. This distance was a strange and unnerving courtesy. It kept her safe from him, perhaps, but in this vast, empty land, with enemies who would surely return, that same cold distance might just be the thing that left her utterly alone, making her easier to claim and easier to sell. He did not return to her side. After a long, still moment, Caleb turned from the barn and walked back to the house, his boots leaving faint prints in the dust. He moved with an economy of motion, a man who wasted nothing, not time, not words, not energy. Elena remained where she was, huddled in the meager shade of the overturned table, the empty canteen clutched in her hands like a talisman. The water had settled the raging fire in her throat, but now a different kind of emptiness made itself known, a deep, hollow ache in her stomach that had been her constant companion for 2 days. Hunger was a slower, more insidious enemy than thirst. It gnawed at you from the inside, hollowing you out until you were nothing but a shell of desperation. When he emerged from the house again, he carried a tin plate and a matching cup. On the plate was a thick, square piece of what looked like cornbread, golden brown and coarse-textured. The cup steamed, sending a thin, dark wisp of vapor into the hot air. He approached with the same deliberate pace, stopping at the same respectful distance as before. He bent down, placing the plate and cup on the ground next to the canteen. "Eat," he said. The word was not a suggestion. It was a command, as rough and unadorned as the landscape around them. His voice was gravelly, the sound of a man who did not use it often, like a tool that had grown rusty from disuse. He retreated once more, not to the barn this time, but to a simple wooden bench that sat against the wall of the house, in a patch of shade cast by the overhang of the roof. He sat down, his back straight, and simply waited, his gaze directed out toward the open range, as if he were a sentinel watching for a threat that only he could see. He had given her food, and now he was giving her the space to eat it, unwatched and unjudged. Elena crawled forward again, her body a collection of aches and pains. She reached for the bread first. It was dry and heavy in her hand. She broke off a small piece and put it in her mouth. It was coarse and crumbly, and she had to chew for a long time before she could swallow. The taste was simple, honest, corn, salt, and maybe a hint of bacon fat. It wasn't delicious, but it was real. It was solid. It was the food of the living. She broke off another piece, and then another, eating slowly, methodically. Then she reached for the cup. The tin was hot to the touch. She lifted it to her lips and took a sip of the coffee. It was black, bitter, and strong enough to strip paint. There was no sugar, no milk, just the pure, unadulterated essence of the roasted bean. The scalding liquid burned her tongue, but as it went down, a profound and immediate warmth spread through her chest, chasing away some of the deep, trembling chill of exhaustion and fear. She took another sip, and another. The bread was for her body, but the coffee felt like it was for her soul, a harsh and potent medicine to shock it back to life. She ate and drank in silence, acutely aware of the man sitting on the bench. He did not look at her, but his presence was a constant, solid fact. He was a wall between her and the empty desert at her back. He was also a mystery, a locked door. Now, with the immediate, animal needs of thirst and hunger being met, her mind began to work again, to circle the question of him, of this place, of what would happen next. The men who had chased her were gone for now, but they were not the kind to give up. They would circle back, they would ask questions, they would find her. And when they did, what would this silent man do? With the last of the cornbread eaten and the cup drained of its bitter, life-giving coffee, she knew she could not remain silent any longer. She had to know where she stood. She pushed herself up, her arms shaking, until she was sitting with her back against the rough wood of the table. Her voice, when it came, was stronger now, steadier, no longer the broken whisper of before. "You could hand me over." She said it quietly, a simple statement of fact directed at his broad, unmoving back. For a long moment, he didn't respond. The wind picked up, sending a skittering sheet of fine, pale dust against the side of the barn. It sounded like a soft, dry rain, the world itself sighing. Then, without turning his head, he answered, "I could." His honesty was as stark and brutal as the midday sun. He acknowledged the truth of her position, the power he held over her. There was no false comfort, no easy reassurance. The admission hung in the air, and a cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach, undoing the warmth of the coffee. She waited. He had not finished. "But I won't," he added, his voice just as flat, just as devoid of emotion. Relief came, but it was a cautious, fragile thing. It was a statement of intent, not a promise, and it was followed by the most important question of all. Why? Why would a solitary man in this dangerous, unforgiving country risk anything for a stranger? As if he could hear the question she didn't dare to ask, he gave her the answer. He finally turned his head, his quiet brown eyes meeting hers across the dusty yard. "You didn't ask for help," he said. "You just needed a place to stop running." And in that simple, profound statement, Elena understood. He wasn't a savior. He wasn't acting out of pity or charity. He was acting on a principle she couldn't have articulated but recognized instantly. He respected the nature of her struggle. She hadn't come to his door begging. She had fought until she had collapsed. She hadn't asked for his protection. She had simply taken his shade. To him, this was a crucial distinction. He was not involving himself in her fight. He was merely providing the ground on which she could catch her breath before the fight began again. With the conversation, such as it was, seemingly over, Elena knew she couldn't stay on the ground forever. She needed to be able to move, to stand on her own 2 feet. Slowly, carefully, she began the arduous process of getting up. She turned onto her hands and knees, every muscle screaming in protest. Using the edge of the overturned table for support, she pushed herself upward, her legs trembling violently under her own weight. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and the world tilted, the horizon swimming in her vision. She gritted her teeth, leaning heavily against the wood, waiting for the feeling to pass. Her eyes, ever watchful, immediately went to the barn. The great doors were still open, revealing the cool, dark interior, and the rifle was still there, hanging on its peg. It seemed different now. Less of a threat, less of a test, and more of a silent statement. It was a symbol of the trust he had given her, a trust that was as clean and functional as the weapon itself, but also as old and precarious as the cracked leather strap it hung from. The trust of a man who understood violence and who had just offered her a moment of peace instead. Caleb seemed to pay her struggle no mind. He rose from the bench and walked not toward her, but toward a series of pegs on the outside wall of the barn. He took down a long, thick length of rope, one end of which was badly frayed, its strands unraveled like a burst seed pod. He carried it to an old, weathered crate near the barn door and sat down. The rope coiled at his feet. From a leather pouch on his belt, he produced a small, curved blade and a pointed wooden tool called a fid. And then he began to work. Elena watched him, her breath still coming in shallow pants from the effort of standing. His hands, which had looked so powerful holding the axe, were now engaged in a task of intricate, patient repair. They were large, calloused, and scarred, the hands of a man who spoke to the world through his labor. With the tip of the fid, he carefully separated the thick strands of the rope. Then, with movements that were slow, steady, and utterly sure, he began to weave the frayed ends back into the main body of the line, creating a splice that was stronger than the original rope had been. He did not rush. There was no wasted motion, no sign of impatience. He worked with the deep, ingrained calm of a man who had long ago made his peace with time. A man who had stopped fighting the relentless turning of the seasons and had learned to move with them instead. He was like the land itself, patient, enduring, and powerful in his stillness. She had been given food, water, a weapon if she chose, and now this strange, unspoken acceptance. But she did not even know his name. She had only heard it shouted once, by the men who were hunting her. It felt important to say it, to see if it was real, to see if it would bridge even a fraction of the vast, silent distance between them. "Caleb," she said. Her voice was still rough, but the name came out clearly. He did not stop his work. The rhythmic pass of his hands, tucking one strand under another, continued without a pause. But he lifted his head just enough to acknowledge her, giving a single, brief nod. It was not a greeting. It was not an invitation to further conversation. It was a simple confirmation. "Yes, that is my name. Yes, I hear you." And it was enough. She stood there, leaning against the table, watching him mend the broken rope under the vast, empty sky. A man of so few words, of such deliberate and quiet actions, did not live this way by accident. This solitude, this discipline, it was a fortress he had built for himself. And today, she had breached its walls. He was offering her shelter, a temporary sanctuary from the storm that pursued her. But as she watched his patient hands restoring what was broken, a new question began to form in her mind. A question far more complicated than whether he would turn her in. A man who builds a fortress this strong, this quiet, is usually hiding something precious. Was he protecting her from the world outside, or was he protecting himself? And some deep, unspoken sorrow within, from the world she had brought crashing into his for 3 days. The ranch was a world unto itself. The vast, silent land was a buffer, and the simple, repetitive rhythm of Caleb's life became a strange kind of medicine for Elena. He worked from sunup to sundown, his movements as predictable and steady as the sun's own arc across the sky. He mended the fence where she had broken through, his hands twisting the old wire with practiced ease. He cleaned the stalls, split firewood, and repaired a leather harness, each task performed with a quiet, focused intensity that seemed to leave no room for questions or conversation. He never asked her about her past. He never asked where she was from or who pursued her. He simply left food for her on the bench by the house, more of the coarse cornbread, a strip of dried meat, a piece of fruit when he had it. He gave her a clean, rough-spun shirt and a pair of sturdy trousers that had belonged to someone long gone, leaving them folded on the porch for her to find. In return, she kept to herself, finding small ways to contribute that required no instruction. She swept the porch clear of the ever-present dust. She pulled the most stubborn weeds from a small, struggling garden patch behind the house, and she washed the tin plates and cups in the basin by the water pump, her movements slow and careful, They existed in a state of shared silence, moving in separate orbits around the central gravity of the ranch house. It was a fragile peace, a temporary truce with the world, and Elena knew, with a certainty that settled like a cold stone in her gut, that it could not last. The world arrived on the fourth day, carried on the back of 3 tired-looking horses. They didn't ride up to the house. Instead, they reined in just outside the fence line, a casual, arrogant slouch in their saddles. They were lean, dusty men with mean, squinting eyes that took in everything and valued nothing. They looked at the house, the barn, and then their gaze settled on Elena, who was sitting on the porch steps, trying to stitch a tear in her old dress. She froze, the needle held motionless in her fingers. The men murmured to each other, their voices low and carrying on the still, hot air. One of them, a man with a stained, drooping mustache, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Well now, Jed," he said, his voice a lazy drawl meant to be overheard. "Looks like old man Rourke's finally gone and got himself some company. And a pretty little thing, too." The man called Jed, younger and thinner than the others, let his eyes roam over Elena in a way that made her feel stripped bare. "A bit of a foreigner, I'd say. Dark hair like that. Wonder where he found a stray like her." The third man chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "A man gets lonely out here. An old fella like Rourke. He must get real lonely. Likes his guests young, it seems." The words were slick with insinuation, designed to be as sharp and dirty as the spurs on their boots. Each syllable was a violation, turning Caleb's quiet decency into something cheap and sordid. Elena's hands clenched into fists in her lap, her knuckles white. A hot wave of shame washed over her, so intense it felt like a physical fever. It was followed by a cold, familiar anger. This was how it always was. Men like these, with their small lives and smaller minds, could not imagine a kindness that did not have a selfish, ugly root. They saw a woman in trouble and saw only an opportunity, a commodity. Before she could think of what to do, run inside, scream at them, or simply endure their leering gaze, the door to the house opened behind her. Caleb stepped out onto the porch. He didn't have his axe, and the rifle was still in the barn. He was empty-handed. He moved to the edge of the porch and simply stood there, his feet planted slightly apart, his arms hanging loose at his sides. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He looked at the 3 men. His gaze was not angry, it was not threatening, it was something far more unnerving. It was heavy, patient, and absolute. It was the gaze of a mountain, ancient and unmoving, regarding a handful of scurrying insects. He looked at them, and in the profound silence that followed, the 3 men began to shrink. Their lazy smirks faltered. The man with the mustache shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Jed suddenly found a piece of his saddle strap intensely interesting. The third man coughed, a small, nervous sound in the vast quiet. Caleb just kept looking. He held them in that silent, weighty gaze, and under its pressure, their casual arrogance crumbled into dust. They had come looking for sport, to poke and pry at the quiet man's life, and they had found themselves weighed, measured, and dismissed in a single, unbroken stare. Finally, the man with the mustache cleared his throat. "Just passing through, Rourke," he mumbled, his voice suddenly stripped of its earlier swagger. He tugged on his reins, turning his horse. "Come on, boys." They rode off without another word, their departure as sudden and graceless as their arrival. They kicked their horses into a trot, as if eager to put distance between themselves and the unnerving stillness of the man on the porch. Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands were still clenched so tightly that her fingernails had left deep crescent moons in her palms. The shame and anger remained, a bitter acid in her throat. Caleb did not look at her. He continued to stare out at the trail the men had taken, his expression unchanged. The peace had been broken. The world now knew she was here. The world did not wait long to send its next emissary. An hour later, a new rider appeared on the horizon. This one was different. He rode a fine, well-groomed horse, and he rode it with an air of easy authority. As he drew closer, Elena saw that his hat was clean, his boots were polished to a dull shine, and the tin star pinned to his vest caught the afternoon sun. This was Sheriff Pike. He rode directly up to the fence, dismounted with practiced ease, and tied his horse to the rail. He opened the gate and walked into the yard as if he owned it, his polished boots crunching on the gravel. He was a man in his 40s, with a neatly trimmed beard and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. It was a smile that was all sharp edges, a weapon disguised as a pleasantry. Caleb had not moved from the porch. He watched the sheriff approach, his body as still as it had been when he faced the other men. "Caleb," Pike said, his voice smooth and confident. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, placing one polished boot on the lowest step. His smile widened, but his eyes were cold and sharp as they flicked from Caleb to Elena and back again. "Heard you had a visitor. Town's buzzing." Caleb said nothing. He simply waited. Pike's smile tightened a fraction. "There's talk. Caleb, you know how people are. A young woman shows up out of nowhere, looking like she's been through a war. It raises questions, and the law has an interest in questions like that." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "The law says a person without papers, without a clear purpose for being here, can't just take up residence. It's for the good of the community. Vagrancy laws." He said the word law as if it were a holy text and he was its sole interpreter. His gaze was fixed on Caleb, a direct challenge. This was not a negotiation, it was a declaration. Caleb shifted his weight slightly, the first movement he had made. He looked down at the sheriff, his expression as flat and unreadable as a stone. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady, each word placed with deliberate care. "The law also says this house is mine," Caleb replied, "and the land it's on, all the way to that fence." The sheriff's smile didn't so much fade as it hardened, like cooling iron. The pretense of friendly concern vanished, replaced by the cold steel of his authority. The two men stared at each other for a long, silent moment. It was a battle of two opposing principles: the public claim of the town's law against the private claim of a man's home. Pike, for all his polished authority, seemed to recognize that this was a line he could not cross without a fight he was not yet prepared to have. "You're making a mistake, Caleb," Pike said, his voice losing its smooth edge. "Protecting a stray will bring you nothing but trouble. The men who were looking for her the other day, they're not the type to forget. They'll be back, and when they come, the law might just be too busy to hear you call." It was a thinly veiled threat. He turned it into a warning. "I'll be back," Pike said, stepping back from the porch. "And I'll have papers of my own. You think about that." He turned on his heel, walked back to his horse, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy silence in his wake. Elena felt a tremor of fear, a cold premonition of what was to come. Pike was not like the three oafs from before. He was patient, and he had the power of the town behind him. She sat on the top step of the porch, wrapping her arms around her knees. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and blood red. The vast beauty of it felt like a mockery. "They won't stop," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. She was speaking to the fading light, to the encroaching shadows, to the certainty of her own fate. Caleb, who had remained standing in the same spot, finally turned his head to look at her. His face was in shadow, his expression impossible to read, but his voice, when he answered, was clear and steady in the quiet air. "Neither will you," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement. He wasn't talking about her running. He was talking about something deeper, something he had seen in her from the moment he found her collapsed in his yard. He was talking about the will to survive, the stubborn refusal to be broken that had carried her this far. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition from one solitary, defiant soul to another. And for the first time in a very, very long time, a smile, faint and fragile as a spider's thread, touched Elena's lips. It was a small, fleeting thing, but it was real, in offering her his protection. Caleb had done more than just provide shelter. He had drawn a battle line. and the price for his kindness was to make an enemy of the world beyond his fence. She knew that Pike and the others would not rest until they had what they wanted, and to get to her, they would now have to tear down the quiet, stubborn man who stood beside her. To justify their actions, they would need a reason, a crime. They would start digging into her past, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that the ghosts she had outrun across the desert were about to be dragged, kicking and screaming, into the light. The sun bled out on the western horizon, leaving behind a bruised, purple sky. Night did not fall gently on Caleb Rourke's ranch. It swept in, a cold, dark tide that swallowed the landscape and brought a restless wind with it. The wind was a liar. It carried the scent of distant rain, a cool, damp promise of relief that it never delivered, serving only to stir the dust into a constant, whispering frenzy. It rattled the loose pane in the window and moaned under the eaves of the house, a lonely, mournful sound. Inside, the world had shrunk to a small, warm circle of light cast by a single oil lamp on the main room's simple wooden table. The flame danced and swayed with every draft, making the shadows on the walls leap and tremble. Elena sat within this circle, her head bent over her work. She was mending the sleeve of the shirt Caleb had given her, the needle moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Each stitch was a tiny act of order in a world that had dissolved into chaos, a small anchor in the uncertain darkness. The flame in the lamp's glass chimney seemed to pulse in time with her own breathing, a fragile, living thing against the vast, pressing night. Across the room, Caleb sat in a straight-backed chair near the cold hearth. The only light that touched him was the flickering glow from the lamp, catching the hard planes of his face and the glint of steel in his hands. He was sharpening a long, heavy skinning knife on a whetstone. The sound filled the small room, a soft, rhythmic scrape and hiss. Shh. It was a sound of preparation, a sound that spoke of a life spent maintaining edges, both of his tools and of his solitude. It was a sound that should have been peaceful, domestic even. But tonight it felt like the slow winding of a clock, counting down to an unknown hour. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was a shared space, a quiet understanding that had grown in the days since Sheriff Pike's visit. They knew the world was coming for them. The only question was when. The when began with a sound that did not belong to the wind. Out in the darkness, one of Caleb's 2 horses, kept in the small corral behind the barn, let out a nervous whinny. It was not a loud sound, but it cut through the moan of the wind, sharp and alert. Caleb's hands stopped. The scraping of the knife ceased. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was sudden and absolute. He didn't look up, but his entire body went still, his head cocked slightly, listening. Elena's needle froze in mid-stitch. She held her breath, her heart beginning a low, heavy drumming against her ribs. The lamp flame, for a moment, burned perfectly still. Then came the second sound, the unmistakable, grinding crunch of a heavy boot on the gravel path that led from the gate to the house. It was a clumsy, deliberate sound, not the careful tread of a man trying to be stealthy. It was the sound of someone who didn't care if he was heard. Then another crunch, and another, joined by a second set of footsteps, and a third. They were not walking in unison. Their steps were uneven, shuffling. 3 men, maybe 4. Caleb placed the knife and the whetstone silently on the hearth beside him. He rose from his chair, not with a sudden jerk, but with a slow, fluid motion, like a man uncoiling. He moved without a sound, a darker shadow detaching itself from the other shadows in the room. He walked to the window and stood just to the side of it, peering out into the blackness. Elena's hands began to tremble. She set the shirt and needle down on the table, her fingers suddenly clumsy and cold. She watched Caleb's back, a solid, unmoving silhouette against the faint starlight visible through the glass. She could hear the footsteps now, closer, accompanied by a low, guttural murmur of voices. They were just outside. There was a moment of heavy silence, and then a loud, rattling thud as someone stumbled against the porch steps. A muffled curse followed. They were on the porch now. The thin wooden door was the only thing separating the small, warm circle of light from the men in the darkness. The door handle rattled, a sharp, metallic sound that made Elena jump. Then, the door itself began to creak open, its old iron hinges groaning in protest. A sliver of cold. Night air sliced into the room, making the lamp flame gutter wildly. A man's shape filled the doorway, a hulking silhouette against the night. Two others crowded behind him. It was Jed and his companions from the other day, their faces flushed and ugly in the lamplight, their eyes, glistening and mean, fixed on Elena. The air they brought in with them smelled of cheap whiskey and a deep, simmering malice. The man in front, the one with the drooping mustache, swayed on his feet. A sneering, drunken smile twisted his lips. "Well now, Rourke," he slurred, his words thick and ugly. "We told the sheriff you had company. He didn't seem to want to do nothing about it, so we figured we'd come extend a proper welcome ourselves." Caleb had not moved from his position by the window. He turned his head slowly, his face half in shadow, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "This is private property," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Get out!" Jed laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Private property. This ain't about your property, old man." His eyes slid back to Elena, a possessive, calculating look in them. "You don't own the girl. She ain't yours. And a thing like her, she's worth something to the right people." The words hung in the air, stripping away all pretense. They were not here to intimidate. They were here to take her. In that instant, Caleb moved. It was not a fast movement, but it was one of immense, inexorable power. His shoulders seemed to broaden, and he leaned forward slightly, his weight shifting onto the balls of his feet. He looked like a boulder on a hillside, balanced precariously, ready to slide and crush everything in its path. But as he took his first step forward, another shadow moved from the corner of the room. Elena stepped out of the darkness and into the lamplight. In her hands, she held the old Winchester from the barn. She had fetched it hours ago, after dark, and had kept it hidden in the corner, a cold piece of steel and a silent prayer. Her arms were shaking, the long barrel of the rifle trembling so much that the light caught on it in a wavering line, but her face was pale and set, and her eyes, fixed on the man in the doorway, did not waver at all. She held the weapon awkwardly, but she held it. The man with the mustache stared at her, his drunken smile faltering for a second. He saw the shaking rifle, and his smile returned, wider and uglier. "Look at that," he sneered. "The little stray thinks she's a wolf. You even know how to use that thing, girl." He took a confident, swaggering step into the room, reaching for her. "Give me that before you hurt yourself." It happened in a blur of motion. As his hand reached out, Elena did not pull the trigger. She did something faster, more instinctual. She took a half step back, reversed her grip on the rifle, and swung it like a club. The heavy wooden stock of the Winchester slammed into the side of the man's head with a sickening, solid crack. He grunted, a sound of pure, shocked pain, and stumbled sideways, his hand flying to his head. When he pulled it away, his fingers were slick with a dark wetness that glistened in the lamplight. He stared at his hand, and then at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and gathering rage. The moment of stunned silence was broken as the other two men roared and charged into the room. One lunged for Elena, the other went for Caleb. Caleb met his man with a force that was shocking in its efficiency. He didn't throw a punch. He stepped into the man's charge and drove the heel of his hand upward, under the man's chin. The man's head snapped back, his legs went out from under him, and he collapsed in a heap on the floor. The other man, Jed, was almost on top of Elena. She tried to bring the rifle back around, but he was too close. He grabbed the barrel, his face a mask of fury, and tried to wrench it from her grasp. She held on, her knuckles straining, the two of them locked in a desperate, grunting struggle. Then, a sound tore through the small house, a sound so loud and final it seemed to shake the very timbers. Bang! A deafening roar, a flash of brilliant orange light. Caleb stood over the man on the floor, the rifle he'd snatched from the wall in his hands, its barrel pointed at the ceiling. The room was suddenly filled with the acrid, choking smell of gunpowder. Plaster dust rained down from a new hole in the ceiling. The effect was instantaneous. The struggle stopped. Jed froze, his hands still on the rifle barrel, his eyes wide with terror. The man Elena had hit was cowering by the door, holding his bleeding head. Outside, the horses, spooked by the gunshot, began to scream and pull against their reins. Caleb lowered the rifle, the muzzle now pointing directly at Jed's chest. "I told you," he said, his voice dangerously quiet in the ringing silence. "Get out." Jed let go of Elena's rifle as if it were red hot. He scrambled backward, tripping over his own feet. He and the first man dragged their unconscious companion out of the doorway and into the night. They stumbled off the porch, their drunken bravado utterly gone, replaced by a raw, animal panic. "This ain't over. Rourke," one of them screamed from the darkness, his voice thin and shaky. "You'll pay for this, you both will." The threats were left behind like garbage on the wind as they fumbled with their terrified horses and galloped away into the blackness. Silence descended again, thick and heavy, smelling of smoke and violence. Elena stood trembling, the old Winchester feeling impossibly heavy in her hands. Caleb calmly ejected the spent cartridge, the brass casing tinkling as it hit the wooden floor. The immediate danger had passed. They had won. But the gunshot had not been the end of the night's business. It was a beginning. The roar of the rifle had ripped through the quiet fabric of the night, a loud, violent declaration to anyone within miles. It was a signal, a beacon. It announced to the sheriff, to the town, and to anyone else who might be listening in the darkness, that the standoff at the Rourke Ranch had just escalated. The sound was an invitation. And out there, somewhere in the vast, watching darkness, someone else had surely heard it, someone they hadn't seen yet. Dawn arrived quietly, as if tiptoeing so as not to wake the bruised and sleeping land. It came first as a faint, pearlescent gray along the sharp spine of the eastern mesas, slowly chasing away the deepest of the night's shadows. The air was cool and still, scrubbed clean by the dry wind of the night before. But the peace was a fragile veneer. A faint, sharp smell still clung to the earth around the porch, the ghost of burnt gunpowder, a chemical tang that did not belong with the natural sense of dust and dry grass. Elena found Caleb sitting on the top step of the porch, exactly where she had sat yesterday. He was staring out at the growing light, his posture rigid. In the pale dawn, she could see that his left hand, the one he had used to strike the intruder, was wrapped in a strip of clean, white cloth. A dark stain had begun to seep through the bandage at the knuckles. He had tended to his own wounds in the silent hours before sunrise. She had not slept. After the chaos, after they had barred the door and settled into a tense, watchful silence, sleep had been an impossibility. She had spent the night in the chair by the hearth, the heavy Winchester resting across her lap, her mind replaying the violent, clumsy struggle, the deafening roar of the shot, the acrid smoke. Now, seeing him there, so still and solitary, she felt a strange pull, a need to break the isolation that the violence had imposed on them both. Without a word, she went back inside, stoked the embers in the wood stove, and made coffee. When it was done, black and strong, she poured it into 2 tin cups and carried them outside. The steam rose from the cups in the cool air, 2 small white flags of truce against the lingering tension of the night. She approached him slowly and held out one of the cups. He turned his head, his eyes shadowed and weary. He looked at the cup, then at her face, and for a moment, she saw something in his expression she hadn't seen before, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that went far beyond a single sleepless night. He took the cup with his uninjured hand, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. The contact was fleeting, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her, a tiny spark of warmth in the cool morning. She sat down on the step beside him, not too close, but near enough that their shoulders were almost touching. They sat in silence, 2 solitary figures watching the world be reborn. The sun finally broke over the distant ridge, spilling liquid gold across the land, chasing the last of the purple shadows from the hollows. The light was soft, gentle, a balm on the raw nerves of the night. It warmed their faces, turned the dust motes in the air into glittering jewels, and made the world seem new and clean, as if the violence had been just a bad dream. They drank their coffee, the bitter, hot liquid a welcome anchor to the present moment. The silence wasn't empty, it was filled with the shared memory of the fight, the shared victory, and the unspoken understanding that something fundamental had shifted between them. Finally, when the sun was fully clear of the horizon and the day had officially begun, Caleb spoke. His voice was low and rough from a lack of sleep. "You can go today," he said, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "The road will be clear for a while. They won't be back soon, not in daylight. You could be halfway to the next territory by nightfall." He was offering her an escape, the freedom she had been running toward for so long. He was untying the invisible rope that bound her to this place, giving her permission to resume her flight. It was a decent, honorable thing to do. He had given her shelter, defended her, and now he was letting her go. No questions asked, no debt claimed. Elena looked down at her own hands, resting on her knees. They were not soft. They were chapped and calloused from her work in the blacksmith's shop, with a fine tracery of old, silvery scars across the knuckles from burns and slips. Each scar was a memory, a testament to a life of hard labor and small pains. She thought of all the roads she had traveled, the dusty tracks and hidden trails. She thought of the constant, gnawing fear, the feeling of always looking over her shoulder, of never being able to rest, truly rest, for a single moment. She had been running her entire life, from poverty, from loneliness, from the cruelties of men. This last flight was just the most desperate chapter in a very long book. "I've been running my whole life," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the still morning air. She traced one of the old scars on her hand with her fingertip. Maybe it's time to stop." She risked a glance at him. He had turned his head and was looking at her, his expression unreadable in the morning glare. He studied her face, his quiet brown eyes searching for something. She met his gaze without flinching, letting him see the exhaustion, the fear, but also the small, hard kernel of defiance that had brought her this far. He was silent for a long time. The sun climbed higher, warming the wooden steps beneath them. A lone hawk circled in the vast blue emptiness above. Then, a slow change came over his face. The hard, stoic lines around his mouth softened. It was not quite a smile, but it was the closest thing she had ever seen to one on his face. It was a gentle, weary expression of acceptance, of understanding. "Stay," he said. The word was so soft it was almost lost in the morning air. It was not a command. It was not a plea. It was an invitation. It was the offering of a piece of his solitude, a place to breathe, a patch of solid ground in a world that had felt like quicksand. In that single word, she heard not possession, but permission. Permission to stop. Permission to just be. And so she stayed. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm, a quiet routine of shared work and shared space. The unspoken tension of being a guest, a fugitive, began to dissolve, replaced by the simple reality of a life being lived. She learned. He didn't so much teach her as he allowed her to watch and then to try. She learned the feel of a horse's lead rope in her hand, the quiet language of pressure and release needed to guide the powerful animal. She learned to mend the wire fences, her hands growing tougher as she handled the sharp, rusty strands. He showed her how to tie a bowline, a knot that would not slip, his large, scarred hands moving with a slow, deliberate grace as he guided hers through the motions. They worked, often in silence, side by side under the vast, indifferent sky. Their conversations were brief, functional, about the weather, or the state of the well, or a loose board on the barn roof. But in the shared labor, a different kind of communication took place. In the way he passed her a tool without being asked. In the way she brought him a canteen of cool water when the sun was at its highest, they began to build a language of their own, one of gestures and quiet understanding. The whispers and rumors from Dry Mesa, which had felt so threatening after Sheriff Pike's visit, began to seem distant and unimportant. They were a faint, angry buzzing on the horizon. But here, within the boundaries of the ranch, the only things that mattered were the sun, the wind, the work, and the quiet presence of another human being. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the colors of the sunset bleed across the sky, a question that had been sitting in Elena's heart finally rose to her lips. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. "Helping me?" He was mending a piece of leather harness, his head bent over the task. He didn't look up, but his hands stilled. "No," he said, his voice a low rumble. He pulled a stitch tight with a practiced tug. "An opportunity to do the right thing. It's a rare thing in this world. You don't waste it." It was the most he had ever said about his own beliefs, a small glimpse into the moral code that guided his solitary life. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling of safety that was deeper and more real than any she had ever known. He finished his stitch, then set the harness aside. He finally looked at her, his eyes clear and direct in the fading light. A strange, sad softness touched his expression. "You saved me too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You just don't know it yet." The words settled between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. They were a confession, a puzzle, a key to a door she hadn't even known was there. He turned his gaze back to the darkening horizon, leaving her to ponder the immense, unsettling question. Save him from what? What old sin? What deep and abiding guilt? Was this quiet, solitary man carrying what ghost from his past had been soothed, even for a moment, by the violent arrival of hers? His words hung in the twilight air long after he'd gone inside, leaving Elena alone on the porch with the encroaching darkness and the weight of his confession. "You saved me too." The phrase was a lock, and she knew, with a sudden, aching certainty, that her own story was the key. Trust was a currency, and he had just paid his share. The next afternoon, she found him by the water pump, sluicing the day's grime from his face and arms. The sun was hot, and the water that splashed onto the thirsty ground evaporated almost instantly. He worked the pump handle, the rhythmic squeak and groan a familiar part of the ranch's quiet language. Elena approached, carrying a bucket she meant to fill for the small garden. For a moment, she just watched him. The water ran in rivulets down his tanned skin, catching in the creases of his neck, washing away the dust. It felt like a ritual, a daily baptism to cleanse the soul of the land's harshness. She set her bucket down, the sound making him look up. His hair was damp, plastered to his forehead, and his eyes seemed clearer, deeper, in the harsh light. The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Now. The time was now. "I worked in a forge," she began, her voice quiet, almost shy. It felt strange to give voice to the life she had fled, to pull those memories out from the dusty corners of her mind. "In Silver Creek, my father was the smith. When he passed, I kept the place going. I wasn't as strong as him, but I was good with the fine work. Branding irons, gate hinges, tool repairs. I liked the heat, the smell of the coal fire, the way you could take a hard, stubborn piece of iron and make it into something useful." She spoke of the rhythms of that life, the clang of the hammer, the hiss of hot metal in the quenching tub, the burn of soot in her lungs. She painted a picture of a small, solitary existence, not unlike his own, but one lived within the confines of a town, a life of labor, of independence bought with sweat and calluses. Caleb leaned against the wooden frame of the pump, his arms crossed over his chest. He listened with an unnerving stillness, his face a mask of quiet attention. He did not prompt her or interrupt. He simply provided the space for her story to unfold. "There was a bank in Silver Creek," she continued, her voice dropping lower. "The Miners and Merchants Trust. One afternoon, I was delivering a new lockbox I'd made for the manager. I came in through the back alley, as I always did. The back door was ajar. I heard voices inside, angry voices." She paused, her eyes becoming distant. seeing not the sun-drenched ranch yard, but the dim, dusty storeroom of the bank. I saw them. 3 men. They had the manager and the clerk tied up. They were stuffing canvas bags with money. But that wasn't the worst of it. The man giving the orders. He wasn't wearing a mask. And I knew him. He was a circuit judge, a man who passed through town twice a year, talking about justice and order. The secret was out now, a poisoned thing released into the clean desert air. He saw me, just for a second. Our eyes met before I could duck back out of sight. I ran. I didn't go to the town marshal. Who do you go to when the law itself is the criminal? I packed a small bag and I fled that night. "The men who chased you," Caleb said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a question. "They found me 2 days later." Elena nodded, a tremor running through her. "The men from the other night, Jed and the others, they weren't the robbers. They were hired to clean up the mess. They wore tin stars, claimed they were deputies taking me in for questioning about the robbery, an escort. But the way they looked at me, the things they said, I knew it was a lie. It was an escort to a shallow grave. That's when I started to really run." She fell silent. The whole sordid story lay between them, ugly and sharp-edged. She had been hunted not because she was a criminal, but because she was a witness, because she held a truth that could unravel a powerful man's life. Caleb did not speak for a long time. His gaze, which had been fixed on her face, drifted away. It moved past the barn, past the fence line, to a place on a low, windswept hill to the north of the house. It was a small, unremarkable rise of earth, distinguished only by a single, weathered wooden cross, tilted by time and wind. There was no name on it, just 2 pieces of silvered wood, bound together with a strip of rawhide. He stared at that lonely marker as if he could see right through the dry earth. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollowed out, scraped raw by a memory he had clearly not revisited in a very long time. "During the border wars," he began, his eyes still fixed on the cross, "I was a scout, younger then, foolish. I thought being fast was the same as being smart." He paused, swallowing hard. "There was a settlement, a small place. The people I was with, we were supposed to protect it. We got word that a raiding party was coming. I was sent ahead to see their numbers, their position." His hands, resting on his crossed arms, clenched into fists. "I saw them, but I misjudged their speed. I thought we had more time. I rode back fast as I could. I told my captain we needed to move, to set an ambush down the canyon. He was an older man, cautious. He wanted to wait for confirmation. I argued. I pushed. I told him every second we waited was a risk, that we had to be fast." He finally tore his gaze from the grave and looked at Elena. The pain in his eyes was a raw, physical thing. "He listened to me. We moved out, fast and hard. We rode right into their main force. It was a trap. I had been so focused on speed. I hadn't seen the whole picture. I had led us into a slaughter." He took a shaky breath. Maria was there, in the settlement. She had come to work as a teacher for the children. The name was spoken so softly it was almost carried away by the wind. She didn't make it. None of them did. We were too busy getting ourselves killed to protect them. I was too late because I was in too much of a hurry." The pieces clicked into place for Elena, sharp and painful. She remembered the first words she had gasped out to him from under the table, words torn from a different, brutal memory of her own. A phrase that, by some cruel twist of fate, had struck the deepest, most agonizing chord in him. "Be gentle, it's too fast," she whispered, the words tasting of ash. Caleb gave a slow, pained nod. "Haste killed the person I loved. It buried a part of me on that hill." He looked back at the cross. "When you said that, it was like hearing a ghost. It stopped me cold. It reminded me that some things, you can't rush, that sometimes, the most important thing you can do is stand still." In that moment of shared, devastating honesty, the last of the walls between them crumbled. They were no longer just a man and a woman thrown together by circumstance. They were 2 survivors, 2 souls marked by the ghosts of their past, each bearing scars that the other could, for the first time, truly see. They had both learned the terrible price of being too fast and the desperate need for a moment of gentleness. From that day on, a new law was written between them, an unspoken pact. There would be no easy promises, no vows made until they were certain they could be kept. And there would be no touch, no physical comfort, until the world outside stopped trying to tear them apart. Their connection would be built on the solid ground of patience, not the shifting sands of need. Their new understanding found its expression in the training of a young colt Caleb had bought a few months back. The horse was a beautiful creature, all nerves and flashing eyes, terrified of its own shadow. Any sudden movement, any loud noise, sent it crashing against the corral fence in a panic. Caleb had tried the old ways, with force and a heavy hand, but it had only made the animal more fearful. Now they tried a different way, together. They would stand in the center of the corral and simply let the horse run itself tired. Then, Elena, speaking in a low, soothing voice, would approach. She would hold out her hand, not with a rope, but with a handful of sweet grass. When the horse shied away, she would retreat and wait. Day after day, they repeated the ritual. Caleb would stand back, a silent, watchful presence, his stillness a calming anchor. He let Elena lead. He let time and patience do the work that force could not. Slowly, miraculously, it began to work. The colt started to watch them with curiosity instead of terror. One afternoon, it took a tentative step toward Elena, its velvet nose twitching, and nibbled the grass from her open palm. A few days later, Caleb was able to gently loop a soft rope over its neck. The rope wasn't a tool of control, but a line of connection, a bond offered, not forced. As they stood side by side, stroking the horse's trembling flank, their hands inches apart but not touching, they were not just taming a wild animal, they were healing something in themselves. But while they were building their quiet sanctuary, the world outside was sharpening its knives. In the dusty town of Dry Mesa, Sheriff Pike stood in the alley behind the saloon, the setting sun casting his long shadow on the wall. A man stood before him, a stranger with a city suit and a face that was blandly professional. Pike took the thick envelope the man offered, his thumb rifling through the bills inside. New boot prints, sharp-heeled and unlike the worn scuffs of local ranchers, were found one morning in the soft earth just beyond Caleb's fence line. Someone was watching. That evening, the stranger from the alley pushed through the swinging doors of the Dry Mesa saloon. He moved with a quiet purpose that set him apart from the loud, boisterous cowboys. He ordered a whiskey, and as he drank, his eyes scanned the room. He was not a gunslinger, nor a drifter. He was something more precise, more dangerous. His name was Marlowe, and he was a hunter of a different kind. He leaned toward the bartender, his voice low and confidential. "I'm looking for someone," he said, placing a silver dollar on the bar. "A young woman, dark hair, might have come into town a week or so back, looking like she'd been through hell." He paused, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. "She'd be memorable, maybe carrying an old, beat-up rifle." The bartender's eyes flickered with recognition. The coin had changed hands. The next night would bring more than just threats. The uneasy peace held for a week, a fragile bubble of quiet work and shared silence. But they both knew it was a bubble, and the world outside was full of sharp objects. The need for supplies, salt, flour, more bandages for Caleb's hand finally forced the issue. They could not hide forever. To stay was to starve. To go to town was to walk into the lion's den. They chose the lion. They rode into Dry Mesa in the flat, white heat of midday. The town seemed to hold its breath as they approached. Windows became vacant eyes. Conversations on the boardwalks faltered and died. The air, which should have been filled with the sounds of commerce and life, was thick with a hostile, waiting silence. They tied their horses in front of Henderson's general store, the only place for miles to get what they needed. Before Caleb could even dismount, they appeared, Jed, the man with the drooping mustache, and their third companion emerged from the alley beside the saloon. They were not drunk this time. Their eyes were cold and sober, which was somehow more frightening. And in Jed's hands, he carried a coiled length of thick rope, a hangman's noose tied with ugly, professional precision at one end. He didn't brandish it. He just held it, letting it hang from his hand, a silent, potent threat. "Look what the wind blew in," Jed drawled, his voice loud enough for the entire street to hear. "The old man and his little shadow come to town for a party." People began to emerge from the doorways of their shops and homes. Mr. Henderson, the store owner, a portly man who was usually all smiles and friendly credit, stood on his porch, his face a mask of worry. The Reverend Miller, a man whose sermons on Christian charity were famous, watched from the steps of the church, his Bible clutched in his hand like a shield. A few housewives, their faces pinched with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity, gathered in a small, whispering clutch across the street. Each of them had a reason to be there, a reason that they would tell themselves was righteous. Mr. Henderson saw Caleb and Elena and saw trouble that would scare away paying customers. The Reverend saw a challenge to the moral order of his flock, a man living with a strange woman outside the bonds of matrimony. The housewives saw the specter of violence, the gunshot in the night that had disturbed their sleep, and worried for the safety of their children. They were not evil people. They were fearful people, and their fear was being twisted into a weapon. Elena swung down from her horse before Caleb could stop her. She did not run or hide. She walked to the center of the dusty street and stood there, her hands empty at her sides. She faced Jed and his men, her chin lifted, her gaze direct and unblinking. The sun beat down on her, outlining her small, defiant figure. In her stillness, in her refusal to show fear, she became the calm eye of the storm. The crowd grew quiet, their whispers dying as they watched the lone woman face down the men with the rope. Caleb dismounted, his movements as deliberate and unhurried as always. He reached back to his saddle, but he did not go for a weapon. He untied a coil of simple, functional rope, the kind used for tethering livestock. He walked past Elena, his eyes never leaving Jed's. He stopped at a large wooden block outside the butcher's shop, a block stained with the history of its trade. He placed his coiled rope squarely on top of it. Then he turned to face Jed and the silent, watching town. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the tense air with the clarity of a bell. "Here," he said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before settling back on Jed's noose. "Restraints are for livestock." The simple, damning statement hung in the air. He had not threatened them. He had defined them. He had held up a mirror to their mob mentality, and the reflection was ugly. Jed's face flushed a dark, mottled red. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Before Jed could spit out a reply, a familiar figure pushed his way through the onlookers. Sheriff Pike, his badge gleaming, his expression one of grave concern, held up his hands as if to calm a riot that had not yet begun. Now, let's have no trouble here," he said, his voice the smooth, reasonable tone of a man in charge. "Jed, put that rope away. Caleb, we can't have this kind of disturbance." He was playing the peacemaker, but his eyes were hard. He was using the confrontation as his justification. "This woman is a person of interest," Pike declared, his voice taking on an official, legalistic edge. "There are questions about her presence here, for the safety of the community. I need to conduct a search of your property. Caleb, I need to know what you're hiding out there." It was the move he had been waiting to make, the perfect excuse to invade Caleb's fortress under the color of law. The crowd murmured its assent. A search was reasonable. It was for their own safety. But it was Elena who answered, not Caleb. She took a step forward, her voice clear and steady, all traces of the terrified runaway gone. "He's hiding nothing, and I am not a person of interest. I am a witness." From a small leather pouch at her belt, she produced a folded, creased piece of paper. She held it up for all to see. It was a simple receipt, dated from 6 weeks prior, for the lockbox she had delivered to the Miners and Merchants Trust in Silver Creek. But at the bottom, crisp and official, was the bank's corporate seal, an embossed eagle that was unmistakable. "This is my receipt for work done on the day of the robbery," she said, her voice ringing with the simple power of the truth. "The men who are hunting me are not the law. They are accessories to the crime. They are hunting me to silence me, not to bring me to justice." A new sound rippled through the crowd, a murmur of confusion, of doubt. The story was not as simple as they had been led to believe. A woman who kept her receipts, a woman with the seal of a bank on her papers, was not a common vagrant. Mr. Henderson, the shopkeeper, lowered his gaze, a flicker of shame on his face. The Reverend Miller's grip on his Bible loosened. The narrative had fractured. The town, which had been so sure of its righteous fear, was beginning to choose a different side. It was at that moment that a new player stepped onto the stage. A man in a clean city suit pushed gently through the crowd. He was of medium height, with a forgettable face and polite, intelligent eyes. He moved with an air of quiet, professional confidence that made Sheriff Pike look like a clumsy amateur. It was Marlowe. He stopped before Elena, giving her a small, almost sympathetic smile. He ignored the rest of them completely. "Miss Duarte," he said, his voice calm and cultured. "My name is Marlowe. I've been sent to find you. There has been a great deal of confusion, and I am here to clear it up." He produced a small, leather-bound case from his inner coat pocket and flipped it open. Inside, pinned to the velvet lining, was a small, ornate silver shield. "I'm a private agent, retained by the bank's investors to ensure this matter is handled correctly and discreetly. We need your testimony to secure a conviction against the men who robbed the bank." Sheriff Pike was merely following a lead as any good lawman would, man. He made it all sound so reasonable, so logical. He was here to help. "I am here," he continued, his smile never wavering, "to offer you a personal escort back to Silver Creek, where you can give your statement to the proper authorities. Your safety will be my personal guarantee." The offer was a life raft. He was offering her the full protection of the law she had been so desperate to find. The crowd sighed in collective relief. The professional had arrived to clean up the mess. But Caleb was watching Marlowe's hands, watching his eyes. He saw the way the agent's smile was a carefully constructed mask. And he saw the badge. It was not the badge of a Pinkerton or a standard federal agent. It was a private insignia, one he recognized from his time in the territories, the mark of a corporate enforcer, a man whose only loyalty was to the money that paid him. This was not a rescue. It was a capture, wrapped in the guise of the law. Marlowe's personal guarantee of safety was a guarantee of a quiet, permanent silence. This wasn't a drunken mob anymore. It was a legal trap, sprung in broad daylight, with the entire town as witnesses to their reasonableness. Caleb looked at Elena, then at the polite, smiling killer in front of her. The choice was suddenly, brutally clear. If Elena went with Marlowe, if they followed this twisted version of the law, she would be dead before she ever saw a courthouse. If he fought them here, if he resisted this legal abduction, he and Elena would become outlaws, fugitives from a law that had been bought and paid for by the very men she could identify. To follow the law was a death sentence. To fight it would mean the end of his ranch, his life, and any hope for a peaceful future. The sky began to change in the late afternoon. It was not the promising gray of a coming rainstorm, but a sickly, yellowish brown that seemed to press down on the land, suffocating it. The wind, which had been a steady, sighing presence for days, picked up a new, frantic edge. It came in sharp, violent gusts, whipping dust and dried leaves into swirling vortexes that danced across the yard like angry ghosts. There was a charge in the air, a crackling tension that made the hairs on Elena's arms stand on end. It was a dry storm, a tempest of nothing but wind and dust, offering all of the fury and none of the relief. In the corral, the young colt felt it too. The horse, which had been making slow, steady progress under their patient tutelage, was undone by the storm's raw energy. He began to pace the fence line, his head high, his nostrils flared, snorting at the shrieking wind. He was a creature of pure instinct, and his instincts were screaming that the world was coming apart. Elena and Caleb were in the barn, securing the last of the tools, when they heard the sharp, splintering crack of wood. They rushed to the door and saw the colt, wild-eyed and terrified, rearing back against his tether. The hitching post, its wood weakened by sun and time, had snapped at its base. The colt was free, a frayed length of rope still dangling from the halter on his head, a thunderbolt of raw panic ready to be unleashed. He galloped in a tight, frantic circle, the whites of his eyes gleaming, looking for an escape from a threat he could not see. Caleb's reaction was immediate, instinctual. "Stay here," he grunted, and started to move out into the storm of dust, his body coiled, his hands already reaching for the phantom rope, ready to impose order on the chaos. He was a man of action, a man who had survived by meeting force with force, speed with speed. But Elena moved past him. She stepped out into the swirling dust, pulling her bandana up over her nose and mouth. The wind tore at her clothes and whipped her hair across her face, but she did not flinch. She saw the horse, and she did not see a dangerous, half-wild animal. She saw herself, a few weeks ago, collapsed in the dirt, a creature running on the last dregs of terror, cornered and desperate. She saw a heart hammering against its ribs, a mind overwhelmed by a world that was moving too fast. She did not run at the horse. She walked, slowly, into the maelstrom, placing one foot deliberately in front of the other. The colt saw her and shied away, snorting, its muscles bunched and trembling, ready to bolt. She stopped, letting the wind and dust rage around her, and she began to speak, her voice low and calm, a quiet current under the howl of the storm. "Easy now," she murmured, the words almost stolen from her lips by the wind. She was speaking to the horse, but she was also speaking to the ghost of herself. "Slow, be gentle, don't push." She took another slow step. The horse tossed its head, the broken rope whipping through the air. Back at the barn door, Caleb watched, his body frozen in a state of suspended action. Every nerve, every muscle, every lesson learned in a hard life screamed at him to intervene, to rush in, corner the animal, grab the rope, and use his strength to subdue it. It was the fast way, the efficient way, the way a man handled a problem. His hand clenched, his weight shifted forward, ready to spring. And then, the ghost's hand landed on his shoulder. He saw not the dusty corral, but a blood-soaked patch of earth under a merciless sun. He heard not the shrieking of the wind, but the screams of the dying. He saw Maria's face, her eyes wide with a question he could never answer. He had been fast that day. He had pushed. He had forced the issue, confident in his own speed and strength, and his haste had dug a grave. His clenched fist slowly, painfully, uncurled. He took a half-step back, into the shadows of the barn. He opened his hands, palms up, in a gesture of surrender. He was surrendering his instinct. He was surrendering his past. He was surrendering control to the woman in the storm and to the slow, patient power of gentleness. He would not make the same mistake twice. He would let time and patience do their work. He would wait. Elena felt his retreat more than she saw it. She felt the sudden absence of his tense, coiled energy at her back. She knew, in that instant, what he had just done. He had chosen to trust her, to trust this slow, uncertain method. The knowledge settled in her heart, a small, warm stone of courage. She was no longer just a woman trying to calm a horse. She was one half of a silent oath. She took another step. "It's all right," she crooned, her voice a steady, soothing thread. "No one is chasing you. You can stop running now." The colt stopped its frantic pacing. It stood, its sides heaving, its legs trembling, and it watched her. The dust swirled, sometimes hiding her from its view completely. But when it cleared, she was still there, a small, calm presence in the heart of the chaos. She did not approach any further. She just stood and waited and spoke her soft, gentle words. Minutes stretched on. The storm raged. Then, a small miracle. The colt lowered its head, just an inch, its ears, which had been pinned back in terror, swiveled forward, listening. It took a hesitant, shuffling step toward her, and then another. It stretched out its neck, its velvet nose twitching, sniffing at the air between them. It smelled not aggression, not a threat, but a strange and compelling calm. Slowly, as if moving through water, Elena lifted her hand. The colt flinched but did not bolt. She held her hand steady, palm open. The horse took one final step, and its soft, whiskered muzzle brushed against her fingertips. It let out a long, shuddering sigh, the breath warm against her skin. The terror was breaking, like a fever. With her other hand, she reached out and took the frayed end of the broken rope. She did not pull or tug. She simply held it. Then, with a fluid, unhurried motion, she brought the rope up and looped it once, loosely, over the colt's lowered neck. It was not a tether. It was not a restraint. It was an embrace, a connection forged not by force, but by a quiet, shared understanding. The horse leaned into the light pressure, a silent acceptance. Elena looked up then, through the swirling curtain of dust, toward the barn. Caleb was standing at the edge of the shadows, his face streaked with dirt, his hands still open at his sides. His face was a mask of stunned, raw emotion. She saw it all in that one, unguarded look. The memory of his failure, the agony of his hesitation, and the profound, overwhelming relief of his trust being rewarded. His decision not to act, his willingness to be gentle, was the greatest act of strength she had ever witnessed. It was a warmth that spread through her chest, more potent than any fire, a hearth against the winter of her fear. They stood there, locked in that gaze across the chaotic yard, as close as they had ever been, though yards apart. The air between them was charged with something more powerful than the storm's electricity. In his eyes, she saw her own strength reflected back at her. In her calm, he saw the possibility of his own redemption. The shaking in her hands had stopped. It was the dust that betrayed them. It swirled and eddied, a moving wall of brown. And out of that wall, two figures emerged, like specters conjured by the storm itself. It was Sheriff Pike and the quiet, professional agent, Marlowe. They had used the storm as cover, their approach masked by the howling wind. They stood just inside the gate, their long duster coats whipping around them, their faces grim. Pike held up a piece of paper, though it was instantly snatched and flattened against his hand by the wind. "Elena Duarte!" he shouted, his voice thin and reedy against the gale. "By the authority of the territorial court, I have a warrant for your arrest. You'll come with us now." Marlowe stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the butt of the pistol holstered under his coat. His polite smile was gone, replaced by a look of cold, predatory efficiency. He looked at Caleb, then at Elena, and then at the now calm horse standing beside her. Pike took another step, his own hand dropping to his gun. "The time for games is over, Rourke," he yelled. "Give her to us now. You can do this the easy way." He paused, letting the wind carry his final words, a cold, sharp promise. "Or we can make this quick and clean." The ultimatum hung in the air, a blade sharpened by the wind. Quick. The word was a gunshot in the silence of Caleb's heart. He stood at the precipice of a choice. He had just rediscovered the power of the slow, the gentle, the soft. But in front of him stood the hard reality of the world, two men, armed and sanctioned by the law, who were promising a fast and violent end. To fight was to become the thing he hated. To surrender was to lose everything. The storm raged around them, and in its heart, a deadly quiet fell as two worlds prepared to collide. Who would move first? The wind howled, a physical presence that seemed to be trying to scour the world clean. The crowd that had followed Marlowe and Pike from town huddled together, their faces pinched and wary, watching the drama unfold as if it were a traveling stage play. Jed and his two friends stood at the forefront, a grinning, expectant audience, the ugly noose still dangling from Jed's hand. This was the show they had been promised. "I have a warrant." Pike shouted again over the gale, his voice thin with blustering authority. "The law is the law. Marlowe, take her into custody." Marlowe's polite mask had vanished completely, leaving behind the cold, hard face of a predator. He produced a pair of iron handcuffs from his coat, their metal links glinting dully in the storm's strange, yellow light. He took a single, purposeful step toward Elena. He never took a second. Caleb moved. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't run. He simply stepped out of the shadow of the barn and placed himself directly between Elena and the muzzle of Marlowe's holstered pistol. He was a wall of quiet, unyielding presence. He looked not at Marlowe, but at Sheriff Pike, his eyes burning with a cold fire that had been banked for years. "No one," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the wind's shriek, "does anything quick on my land." The word, the promise of a fast and clean end, was thrown back in Pike's face like a handful of dirt. It was a declaration of principle, a rejection of the violent, hasty world they represented. Marlowe paused, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. This was not going according to his neat, professional plan. "Stand aside, old man. This is official business. You are obstructing justice." "There is no justice here." Elena's voice rang out, clear and strong. She stepped out from behind Caleb's protective shadow, not with a weapon, but with a folded piece of paper in her hand. It was not the simple bank receipt from before. This document was different. It was covered in her own neat, clear handwriting. "Only a conspiracy." She held it up. The wind tore at it, trying to rip it from her grasp, but she held it fast. "This is a copy of my sworn statement, detailing everything I saw at the bank, including the name of the man who led the robbery. It was notarized and filed this morning in Silver Junction." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Silver Junction was a full day's hard ride away. Caleb must have ridden through the night, a silent, desperate journey to a different town, a different law, to give her truth, a legal voice. He had not waited for the fight to come to him. He had prepared for it. Slowly, deliberately, while they slept. Marlowe's professional calm finally shattered. A flash of pure, undisguised fury crossed his face. He lunged, not for Elena, but for the paper, trying to snatch it away. "That's a forgery, it's meaningless." Pike, seeing his advantage slipping away, sneered. "He's right. That paper has no value here in Dry Mesa. I am the law in this town, and I say it means nothing." He was shouting to convince himself as much as the crowd, but his law was beginning to feel small and brittle against the backdrop of the raging storm and the quiet courage of the two people before him. And then another sound broke through the howl of the wind, a deep, resonant clang that made everyone, even Marlowe, flinch and turn. Dong, dong, dong. It was the church bell. It was not a fire alarm, nor a call to worship. It was a slow, solemn toll, a sound that spoke of momentous, communal decisions. Heads turned toward the town, and there, walking into the wind, their heads bowed against the dust, was a small procession. It was led by the Reverend Miller, his black coat flapping around him. Behind him was Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper, and two of the housewives who had watched from their porches. They were no longer spectators. They were participants. The Reverend held up a hand to shield his eyes, his face etched with a conflict that had clearly cost him a great deal. "Sheriff Pike," he called out, his voice strong and clear, We have something that may be of interest." "Mr." Henderson stepped forward, holding a small, brown paper-wrapped parcel. "A rider came through from Silver Junction an hour ago, on the mail route," he said, his voice shaky but determined. "He left this at the post office for you, Reverend. A confirmation of a notarized document filed at the courthouse there this morning. The postmark is official." He held out the parcel. It was proof, independent, undeniable proof. The law of Dry Mesa had been superseded by a simple postmark from another town. Justice, it seemed, had found a different voice, one that Pike could not shout down. That was when Marlowe broke. The careful planning, the legal pretenses, the web of authority, it had all come undone by a piece of paper and the conscience of a few ordinary people. his face contorted into a mask of pure animal rage. He was no longer an agent, he was a cornered wolf. With a snarl, he ripped the pistol from his holster. "Enough of this!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "I'll handle this myself." He raised the gun, aiming it squarely at Elena. Caleb saw it happen in a series of slow, agonizing heartbeats. He had his own gun, tucked into his belt. He could draw, he could fire, he could meet this quick violence with his own. The old instincts, the lessons of the border wars, screamed at him to kill or be killed. For a half-second, a fraction of a moment that stretched into an eternity, his hand hovered over the butt of his pistol. He could end this right now, with a bullet. He remembered Maria's face. He remembered the Colt, trembling in the storm. He did not draw. Instead, with a guttural roar, he lunged forward. He didn't go for Marlowe's gun. He went for the man himself. He slammed his body into Marlowe's side, his hand clamping down on the agent's wrist, forcing it upward and away. The gun went off with a deafening crack, the bullet kicking up a spray of dirt harmlessly at their feet. The sound was swallowed by the storm. The two men crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs. Marlowe, wiry and strong, fought with a desperate fury, striking Caleb across the head with his free hand. But Elena was already moving. The lesson of the horse was burned into her very soul. She had learned the rhythm of the storm, the power of a gentle hand. As Marlowe and Caleb struggled, she stepped in, the frayed rope from the Colt's halter still clutched in her hand. She did not panic. She did not scream. She moved with a calm, fluid grace. She looped the rope around Marlowe's gun wrist, the one Caleb was still struggling to hold. She pulled it tight with a single, sharp tug, using the same firm, steady pressure she had used on the Colt. It was not a strangler's knot. It was a binding. She wrapped the rope twice, and then a third time, securing his arm to his side, rendering him weaponless. It was done in a second. A quiet, efficient act that was more final than any gunshot. Seeing Marlowe disarmed and bound, Sheriff Pike's blustering authority collapsed like a house of cards. He looked at the hard, unforgiving faces of the townsfolk who had defied him. He looked at the bound agent on the ground. He slowly, deliberately, took off his hat and held it in his hands, a gesture of absolute surrender. He took a step back, and then another, melting into the crowd. The townspeople moved forward, forming a silent, protective circle around the scene, their bodies a living wall. The fight was over. Caleb staggered to his feet, a dark bruise already forming on his temple from Marlowe's blow. A wave of dizziness hit him, and he swayed, his legs giving out. He began to fall. But Elena was there. She caught him, her small frame surprisingly strong as she braced him, her arm wrapping around his waist. He leaned heavily on her, his head dropping to her shoulder, his breath coming in ragged gasps. She could feel the tremor of exhaustion running through his body. His hand found hers, his fingers lacing through her own, gripping her with a strength that was born of desperation and relief. Her hand was warm, a small, solid anchor in the raging storm. She held him, her cheek pressed against his rough shirt, the smell of gunpowder, sweat, and dust filling her senses. She looked out at the silent, watching faces of the town, at the terrified, bound man on the ground, at the bruised and darkening sky. A single, shuddering breath escaped her lips, a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh. "Be gentle," she whispered, the words spoken to the crowd, to the cruel fate she had outrun, to the wild, galloping rhythm of her own heart. "It's too fast." It was not a plea anymore. It was a prayer. It was a principle. It was a promise. The storm seemed to pause, holding its breath. Caleb's arm tightened around her, pulling her closer. On the porch of the small, battered house, surrounded by the wreckage of the law and the birth of a community's courage, they stood together, two solitary souls bound by a shared act of defiance. The world had been forced to slow down, to stop, and to witness. And in that one, fragile, hard-won moment, as the wind began to die and the dust began to settle, a warmth spread between them, a quiet, steady glow, as bright and as promising as a hearth fire on a long, cold night. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners like you.